Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to episode 5 in our quest with Napoleon trying to reach Moscow. So, Napoleon, however, remained convinced that the arrival of the Grande Armée in Moscow would force Tsar Alexander to negotiate for peace. Now, we have a particular protagonist that documented meticulously everything that occurred throughout the journey from the crossing of the Niemen River deep into Russia and into Moscow. This character is named Sergeant Adrien Jean-Baptiste François Bourgogne. Was a French soldier in Napoleon's Grande Armée, renowned for his vivid memoirs detailing the traumatic experiences of the 1812 Russian campaign and retreat from Moscow. As a non-commissioned officer in the elite Imperial Guard, Bourgogne witnessed firsthand the catastrophic effects of Napoleon's invasion. His memoirs are titled Memoirs du Sergent Bourgogne, 1812 and 1813, provide an unfiltered account of the brutal realities faced by ordinary soldiers. Unlike traditional military histories, Bourgogne's writings capture the psychological and physical toll of war, offering a personal perspective on one of history's most infamous military disasters. His work remains a vital source of understanding and the human cost of Napoleon's ambitions. Sergeant Bourgogne wrote in his diary, "After crossing a large forest, we finally saw Moscow. And in such moments, one forgets everything, the dangers, the fatigue, the fallen comrades. Only one thing matters now, the pleasure of entering the promised city." But when Napoleon arrived, he discovered that Moscow had been abandoned. Unlike his triumphant entries into Vienna and Berlin, there was no welcoming ceremony and no one offered him the keys to the city. Only 10,000 of Moscow's 260,000 residents remained, mostly because they had no way to escape. Napoleon and his guard settled in the Kremlin, and his generals occupied the luxurious residences of the nobility. As Napoleon checked on his divisions, one of his generals suddenly shouted that fires had broken out across the city. There were no fire pumps to stop them, and Napoleon was in disbelief. He couldn't understand why the Russians, in his eyes barbarians, would go so far as to destroy their own city. In a fit of anger, he ordered that the arsonists be found and hanged. At first, he was thought that the fires in Moscow were caused by drunken French soldiers celebrating their first night in the city, but it soon became clear that the fires were not accidental. Dozens of arsonists had been deliberately scattered throughout the city, but who were these arsonists and who had given the order for such widespread destruction? Kutuzov had made the decision to abandon Moscow in order to avoid another battle and give his army time to regroup. The city's governor, it was his name, he was a count, as a title, Count Rostopchin, took matters into his own hands and ordered convicted criminals to set fires to Moscow's warehouses, depot, and palaces. His goal was to leave nothing of value to the French invaders. And Napoleon Grande Armée found itself trapped in the chaos of these fires, surrounded by flames. Even as the city burned, Napoleon continued to dream of victory. Napoleon had defeated the Russians at Borodino, though at a great cost, and had taken Moscow. He expected that this would force Tsar Alexander to negotiate for peace. But the situation had shifted. This was no longer just a war between two emperors. It had become a people's war. The Russian people were not going to ask for peace just because their capital had been occupied. It's strange that Napoleon believed the conquest of Moscow would end the war. He had made similar mistakes before. In 1805, after taking Vienna, the Austrians didn't surrender until the Battle of Austerlitz in 1808, even after occupying Madrid and placing his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, the Spanish continued to fight. Napoleon had convinced himself that, just as in those earlier wars, once he took Moscow, Tsar Alexander would come to the negotiating table. People still thought he was fighting the old formal wars of the Ancien Regime, where kings would settle their differences and then return to friendship. But Napoleon had changed the world, and yet he did not realize that the world had also changed. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander sought to rally the Russian people by blaming the French for the fire. He declared the French had not only invaded Moscow, but had set it ablaze as punishment for Russia's sins. The fire became a symbol of the French brutality and a new rallying cry for Russian resistance. The people of Russia could not accept that their sacred capital had been taken and destroyed. As long as Napoleon had not destroyed the Russian army, Tsar Alexander was determined to continue fighting. There was no reason to seek peace just because Napoleon had taken Moscow. The longer Napoleon stayed, the more difficult it would become for him to maintain control over the city. Suddenly, torrential rains eventually extinguished the fire that had destroyed much of Moscow. Still, Napoleon, lost in his illusions, believed that Tsar Alexander would soon ask for mercy and seek peace. It was only a matter of days, he told himself, that he must not give in now. The arsonists responsible for the destruction were arrested by the hundreds, forced to confess, and sentenced to harsh punishments. Many of the arrested were members of the middle class or Russian police officers, most of whom insisted on their innocence. They were ordered to kill anyone who attempted to escape. Sergeant Bourgogne, a soldier, as we already mentioned, in Napoleon's army, he described his change in outlook. Before reaching Moscow, he had always been cheerful, despite the hardships. He believed that the greatest honors and glory came from facing the greatest dangers. But the events in Moscow shook him deeply. He and other soldiers witnessed disturbing behavior. Looting was widespread, and after the fires, Napoleon did nothing to stop it. His soldiers plundered the city, stealing artworks, jewelry, paintings, and even food and drinks. And many soldiers who found alcohol in the cellars of the bourgeois homes became drunk and were unable to carry out their duties. On the 8th day in Moscow, there was still no word from Tsar Alexander. Napoleon, becoming more desperate, found a way to contact him. He hoped to push Alexander toward an honorable surrender. "Alexander, my brother, I love peace. It is not with pleasure that I come here. I miss my wife and my son, and I do not wish for your unhappiness. But those who serve you only pursue personal glory. I am convinced that if no one interferes between us, our ancient friendship will soon be renewed and all our misfortunes will end." For Tsar Alexander, signing a peace treaty with Napoleon would be a dangerous move. He knew that agreeing to peace was most likely lead to his dethronement, and he would be replaced by someone loyal to the French. Understanding this, Alexander refused to negotiate and even rejected any attempts to engage in talks with Napoleon's emissaries. Meanwhile, Napoleon, having captured the historic capital of Russia, believed the war was over and that it was only a matter of time before peace would be negotiated. As he waited for Alexander's surrender, Napoleon managed French affairs from Moscow and focused on keeping his soldiers occupied. To boost morale, he reopened the French theater in the city, but it was mostly only the troops stationed within Moscow who had the chance to enjoy it. Most of the soldiers, however, were camped outside the city, which had been mostly destroyed by fire. These troops were more vulnerable to attacks, especially from the Russian partisans, armed civilians, including women and peasants, who were fiercely determined to defend their land and avenge their families. The Partisans, which includes groups like Cossacks and Hussars, were not a part of the regular army but were a powerful force in their own right, originating from the southern steppes of Russia, I say steppes or steppes. The Cossacks were communities of free men who had long fought for their autonomy, though they were integrated into the Imperial Russian army. They maintained independence and were used to harass the enemy. They attacked the French from the flanks and rear, disrupting supply lines and creating fear wherever they appeared. Tens of thousands of Cossacks terrorized Napoleon army like ghostly warriors. The Cossacks were known for their guerrilla tactics, ambushing French forces and attacking their supply lines, making them a constant threat to Napoleon's army, while the Hussars were indeed part of the Russian cavalry. They were regular military units and not typically part of the irregular partisan forces. The Hussars played a more conventional role in battles, like the Cossacks, who operated in smaller, more flexible units that were difficult for the French to pin down. The Cossacks, in particular, were skilled in regular warfare and had a deep cultural tradition of autonomy, which allowed them to operate with a high degree of independence. Their presence created a psychological impact on the French, as they would often appear unexpectedly, making them seem like ghostly warriors in the vast Russian landscape. Their harassment contributed to the growing sense of fear and uncertainty among Napoleon's troops. Napoleon grew frustrated that Alexander wasn't responding to his peace proposals. He considered sending his trusted envoy, Armand de Caulaincourt, back to St. Petersburg to push for peace. But Caulaincourt warned him that Alexander wouldn't negotiate, and that time was on the Russian side. The coming winter will be a powerful weapon against the French. Napoleon dismissed the idea that the Russian winter could be a serious threat, but Caulaincourt advised him to prepare his troops and for the harsh conditions ahead. He suggested that soldiers urgently needed supplies like sheepskin coats, gloves, hats, and padded boots to survive the cold. Caulaincourt also pointed out the army's serious logistical problems. Many soldiers had been lost since the beginning of the campaign, and supplies were running low. Additionally, the French army lacked crucial equipment like ice cleats for horses, which would make it difficult for the artillery to move and for the wounded to be cared for. With winter approaching, Caulaincourt urged Napoleon to take advantage of the still favorable conditions to evacuate while they still could, before the situation worsened. Disillusioned, Napoleon declares that leaving Moscow would mean admitting defeat. Growing increasingly frustrated with Caulaincourt's suggestion, he decides to send someone else as an emissary to negotiate a glorious peace on his behalf. In the meantime, he implies that Caulaincourt could return to his friend the Tsar if he so wishes. So I don't know if you noticed throughout this story, somehow Napoleon always dismisses Armand de Caulaincourt, and he is one of his generals, and he's the only voice of reason, that one of his closest aides, that really tells him how the situation is. However, Napoleon is still disillusioned in he's really captured by this idea of victory, that he is still on the top. Therefore, he's unable to see beyond that victory. And Caulaincourt is just pointing him out that you need to do these things and fix these logistical problems if you want to solve, in order to fight and to continue your war. And the recurrent theme is that always Napoleon dismisses Caulaincourt by saying, well, you go back to your friend Alexander. Even if we know that Caulaincourt was at the court of the Tsar Alexander I for a few years, but there is also always, Napoleon always makes these remarks, you go back to your friend the Tsar if you so wish. but Caulaincourt loves France, therefore is trying to be helpful to Napoleon. However, to Napoleon, it looks like he is always talking in favor of the Tsar. Napoleon hopes of Russian capitulation. The hopes of Russian capitulation seem impossible, so he sends another one of his generals, the Marquis of Lauriston, to negotiate with General Kutuzov. Like Caulaincourt, Lauriston had previously served as the French ambassador to St. Petersburg. However, Alexander refuses to negotiate 3 times, growing increasingly tired of the war. On October 19, Napoleon is left with no choice but to leave Moscow. Napoleon, ever the strategist, understands the peril of staying through the Russian winter, and his horses would certainly perish. And although he might not fully realize it, the situation in Paris could be deteriorating as well. After being away for 4 months, he begins to worry about what might be happening back home. As Napoleon hopes for a swift Russian surrender faded with the smoldering ruins of Moscow, the reality began to sink in. His grand campaign was collapsing. The fires had ravaged the city, yet Tsar Alexander remained silent. What had once seemed like a victorious march into Russia now felt like a desperate standoff in a foreign land. With supplies dwindling and the army's morale crumbling, the order to retreat was given. But would the Grande Armée be able to escape the jaws of defeat, or had Napoleon's plans already sealed their fate? As they began their retreat, the soldiers faced not only the crushing Russian winter, but a relentless series of attacks from Russian forces. Would they survive the brutal march back, or would the elements and the enemy prove too much for them? Well, this is the end of our 5th episode, and we will continue next time with episode 6, as we will start seeing the touch actually deeply into all the shortcomings of the army logistically, and we'll see how the numbers of this Grande Armée will start to being reduced and falling prey into general winter, as it was also always known, the winter, the weather. So that's it for today, and I will see you next time